a great American, Lucretia Mott. All right, let's talk about her. The Quaker eldress. I don't know, what do we call her? Preacher? Famous for speaking in Quaker meetings, but also to other denominations. It's a little more difficult in some ways to do Mott because her medium was primarily not the written word, although letters for sure. But the sermon, the spoken sermon, she was famous for the effectiveness of her speaking. And let me try to show that and give you an idea of what she was like as a speaker by quoting a letter of Henry Thoreau to his sister Helen. And this is 1843. In 1849, Thoreau published Civil Disobedience. And I gotta say that the whole thing is Lucretia Mott. It's very Quaker, all right? And if we're talking about transcendentalism, I mean, the best way to think about it, I guess, is anti-Puritan Christianity, a la the Quakers and the Unitarians. And Lucretia Mott preached in Unitarian churches very often as well. And of course, Emerson was a Unitarian minister to start with, and his father was too. But later Emerson, Thoreau, etc., Alcott, they give a secular version of very much the same kind of positions. And so, I think in terms of Henry David Thoreau's political consciousness, which was a little more radical than Emerson's maybe, encounters with people like Lucretia Mott were absolutely key. And I do think that Civil Disobedience is a secular presentation of the ideas that Lucretia Mott and others were putting forward. But Lucretia Mott very compellingly. So this is Henry Thoreau to Helen Thoreau. I believe I've not told you anything about Lucretia Mott. It was a good while ago that I heard her at the Quaker Church in Hester Street. She is a preacher, and it was advertised that she would be present on that day. So that's interesting in itself. She's traveling to Quaker meetings, and they're advertising her sermon. All right, I don't know, the Quaker meetings do like this kind of stuff so much anymore. So she's sojourning among Quaker meetings. And this one was at Hester Street in New York. I liked all the proceedings very well. They're plainly greater harmony and sincerity than elsewhere. They do nothing in a hurry. Everyone that walks up the aisle in his square coat and expansive hat has a history, and comes from a house to a house. They are people with lives and histories. And they come from their house to the house of God in a coherent transition. The women come in one after another in their Quaker bonnets and handkerchiefs, looking like sisters or so many chickadees. At length, after a long silence, waiting for the Spirit, Mrs. Mott rose, took off her bonnet, and began to utter very deliberately what the Spirit suggested. Her self-possession was something to see, if all else failed. But it did not. Her subject was the abuse of the Bible, and thence she straightway digressed to slavery and the degradation of women. It was a good speech. Transcendentalism in its mildest form. And now mildest means not like a watered-down version of transcendentalism, but a Lamb of God version of transcendentalism, like a morally mild, this is a 19th century expression, form. She sat down at length, and after a long and decorous silence in which some seemed to be really digesting her words, the elders shook hands and the meeting dispersed. On the whole, I liked their ways and the plainness of their meeting house. It looked as if it was indeed made for service. All right, so that's Lucretia Mott, the great abolitionist and feminist. Co-convener of Seneca Falls. Now, I mean, we've seen a bunch of this kind of lead up to the Civil War, American pacifism. And I mean, this is one of the great world outbreaks of pacifism, early 19th century USA. Not well enough known, man. I'm going to use Lucretia Mott. I'm using this book, Lucretia Mott Speaks. And so it's records of her sermons, basically, of her speeches. And there's not that much early, right? And most of the earlier sermons but she starts in the, 1820s, really. But her sermons, at least as represented in this book, usually emphasize abolitionism and women's rights in relation to one another, okay? Because all these things are the same in a way for people like Lucretia Mott. I mean, they're not the same, but the approach to them appeals to the same principles and emerges from the same religious traditions. All right. But what I want to talk about with Mott is the Civil War kind of put an end to this beautiful, amazing period of American pacifism that we've been discussing. And it certainly induced a big crisis because all the pacifists were radical abolitionists, okay? And they didn't want anything more than the end of slavery, okay? So some of them endorsed military action to end slavery, or, sadly, in tears, like this is the only way. We see this now. We've tried so hard for so long to do this peacefully. Now it's going to take violence to end it. Okay. Right. Or kind of rationalizing, if you didn't want this kind of violence, you shouldn't have, bought and sold and whipped and harmed and people, okay? Even though it's all wrong or whatever, the war too. So, but let's watch Lucretia Mott grapple with this. I mean, even just the fact that the war, with its hundreds of thousands of deaths, it's just incredible destruction of the whole country, across much of the country, bits of the country, that it took war to end slavery. Right now, if we're pacifists, we're committed pacifists, and maybe we're, how do we grapple with that? Right? It seems like, by the account of radical abolitionists, a legitimate use or a necessary use of violence. So how do we grapple with that? I mean, I would say that the later 19th century is not a golden period of pacifism. It's kind of retrenching into Quaker meetings and stuff like this. There's not a lot of classic material on pacifism published and stuff between the 1850s and the 1890s when Tolstoy gets going again. All right, and by recovering Ballou and Garrison, okay? That's what Tolstoy does. So here is Lucretia Mott talking to the Pennsylvania Peace Society in 1868, just after the Civil War. I mean, a couple years after the Civil War. I think it is very important that we should have such speeches as we have listened to. While we have government based upon war, and that's why Lucretia Mott was an anti-statist. I think I said this before when we were talking about Henry Clark Wright. Lucretia Mott said, quote, close quote, "Far be it from me to suggest that anyone vote in a situation where the government rests on the war-making power, all right, where government rests on violence. But if men have the right, then women must have the right to vote. While we have the government based upon war, and the paraphernalia of war is so attractive following the Civil War and all these war heroes and so on, in the government now and everything. It must be that there are some among us who shall go great lengths and speak as we have heard this evening on behalf of peace, and present the crime of war in its true light. And as well that there is daring enough among us to speak the whole truth on this subject. Like at post-Civil War, it requires even more daring to be a pacifist in Philadelphia or whatever, okay? Long enough have we been accustomed to apologize for the slaveholder, to be reconciled to the system because it was connected with the government, because iniquity was protected by law. The fact that there were those who came forward and held up this great crime in its true light roused the people, and they did not love to have it so. So we condemned the wrong of slavery, and we must condemn and continue to condemn the wrong of war. I regard the abolition of slavery as being much more the result of this moral warfare, which was waged against the great crime of our nation, than as coming from the battlefield. And I always look upon it as a result of the great moral warfare. The abolition of slavery was the result of moral warfare. It's true the government has not risen to the high moral point which was required to accomplish this great object, and it must use the weapons it was accustomed to employ, and in its extremity was compelled to do this great work. So in regard to war, it must be held in its true light, and the enormity of the crime be laid where it belongs. All right, so this is the argument. It's kind of a difficult one in a way for a pacifist. It wasn't the war that ended slavery. It was the sentiment, the anti-slavery sentiment, the moral awakening of the country that led to the abolition of slavery, i.e. that led to the war. All right, so it was the moral force of the arguments that actually abolished slavery. But by the same token, she's not arguing that it would have been abolished without war. She's in a sticky situation, and lots of pacifists were endorsing the purposes for which the Civil War was fought and its outcome in the abolition of slavery, right? The emancipation of the slaves. But continuing to repudiate the means by which that was accomplished. And that is really a difficult position. And she does grapple with it. When all the troubles that are connected with man's relations, that are now made the causes of war, have been presented to the people in the light which they can readily perceive to be true, they will readily accept them, for there is a love of peace in the heart of everyone. She says maybe people are naturally violent, at least under certain circumstances, but they all naturally love peace as well. They will come to see that there is a reasonable principle that will lead us to abandon the barbarism of war. And now the kind of pacifist movement is moving on toward like an international peace initiative type of deal, a kind of League of Nations or UN type of idea, or a world court idea. This was, right into the 20th century. This was central to the peace movement. And she's moving away from like an absolute, she's not repudiating it, but she's moving away from presenting an absolute spiritual prohibition on violence to how can we practically reduce the need for war around the world, as I speak to audiences well beyond, my friends, the friends. Another result that we may look forward to with hope, and all these people were into this too, is the removal of the death penalty. And when this is the case, we can present this to the people as something that will be carried out now. It will be just as it was with slavery, just as the rights of man are coming to be considered all over the world in a far better light than ever have been before. These things may be brought about long before all mankind have come to acknowledge the great principles of right, the love of liberty and the hatred of oppression, and so it will be with the barbarism of war. it will be so presented to the people that they will be aroused to a sense of its enormity, thus placing the crime where it belongs, and then showing that governments can be maintained without resort to deadly force. She sounds a little less anarchist, after the war, but governments still cannot rely on deadly force, all right, if it's legitimate. For Christians, for one thing. This is my idea of this work, that it is much nearer at hand than many suppose. And I'm sure our faith should be firm now that prayers were manifestly answered in regard to the great crime of slavery. So she's saying basically, like, don't despair. I know there's only, and she says stuff like this, there's only a few people at this meeting. But the cause of peace seems to be dying. All right, but don't lose hope. A great moral awakening, maybe kind of worldwide, led to the abolition of slavery. Okay, and a great worldwide awakening leading to the abolition of war is also possible. All right. Here's just a practical issue that arose. Lots of young Quaker men volunteered for the Union Army. Right? You can understand why. Again, like you can understand why, because the whole Friends world is dedicated to abolition. Okay, the Quakers split similarly in Philadelphia, as you might imagine, during the Revolution. And Betsy Ross was a Quaker, and she's sewing flags for Washington or whatever. Right. So they started a free Quaker group, like a pro-war, this war at least, the Revolutionary War, Quaker group, and were extruded from the Orthodox Quakers. But okay, so now what do we do with our young man who did go fight? And now this is actually an important question about like all kinds of stuff, about how we treat returning soldiers, about how a peace movement deals with combatants, okay? And how combatants deal with a peace movement, or what they know that can help a peace movement, like Vietnam veterans against the war. So the question is, and I think this was a practical question, in probably the Race Street meeting where she's the secretary or whatever, can we welcome back people who have fired weapons and killed? Okay. And her answer is yes, we must. So also on the subject of peace, it is a question that has often been with me, whether as a religious body we have borne our testimony faithfully enough, whether it would not have prevented so many of our young men and strong from being induced to enter the army. She's telling us this is 1869. And then so she's saying, like, we should have preached the message of peace even stronger. And then so many of our young men wouldn't have volunteered. I know it's a very delicate subject, real delicate at this point. And many most conscientiously entered into the strife with the hope of doing what they might to bring peace in the right way, without slavery in the land, for they knew that the war which had been waged was against the colored people, slavery, was far greater than any war that we could have where there was an equal conflict. Like the war of white people against unarmed, helpless, enslaved black people is far worse than an equal conflict between the North and the South, say. And our young men thought this. Considerations of this kind were apologies, as they deemed, excuses for entering upon this. But all that has passed, and there certainly has been leniency on the part of the meetings where they have brought these members under dealings, and there has been a disposition to pass all by, to forgive it all. But I trust not with anything like a compromise of the principle. So if we're going to welcome back people who have fought, we can do that, and we should. But we must not compromise our message of nonviolence. I do hope we are all, as a body, more desirous to promote peace on earth and goodwill among men than ever. For now that slavery is done away, we may see how many ways the spirit of war may be opposed. Like there's an opening for the peace movement now, and appeals made for peace that would not have been while we were engaged in such barbarous warfare as slavery. Again, like this international relations context can come out now. Things are possible that weren't possible when the urgent matter was ending slavery immediately. I want we should all be willing to look at this subject of war in its true light and not feel because it is sanctioned as yet by all the nations of the earth, and there is so much glory given to those who are leaders in warfare, that therefore we should not seek to expose its barbarities. It seems to me that it should be the especial duty of those who love and honor the name of Jesus to be opposed to war. I marvel when I see so much in his life and character in favor of peace, that in his testimonies he so clearly pointed out those things when he declared, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, resist not evil. Love thine enemy." How he thought that they should do good for evil, that they should put up the sword, for he that taketh the sword shall perish by the sword, which means if they indulge in this spirit, it will return to them. And one of the apostles asked, from whence come the wars and fighting, if not from the lusts that war in the members? And I just want to point out that Lucretia Mott always thought of nonviolence as an active mode of resistance. And, and here in this sermon, a late one from 1876, she describes the kind of warfare that she approves. And she was a kick-ass, warlike advocate of peace, raging war upon evil, moral war. While I'm in favor of peace, I am also very favorable to war. I mean the firmness and combativeness that marked us in the anti-slavery warfare. And here she's kind of nostalgic for that moment in the 1830s and 40s where people's ideals were expressed with such purity and urgency. We all remember how earnest and determined William Lloyd Garrison was. No man stood more firm for peace, and yet he was constantly fighting with his tongue and with his pen. So if you do evil, like slavery, war, we will fight you peacefully. We will wage war upon you. We declare war on war peacefully. And, this sounds a lot more like the Bayard Rustin, approach later on, nonviolent leaders in the civil rights movement. It's like, this is not a passive thing. This is not sheer non-resistance. This is a mode of resistance. This is a mode of warfare. And Lucretia's moving in that direction. And that's my wonderful hero, Lucretia Mott. I worship from time to time in her in meetings where she was a presence, a big presence, at Arch Street and Race Street in Philly. The Arch Street meeting, I think maybe I haven't seen this lately, featured a cardboard cutout of Lucretia Mott for decades, just in the lobby there. If you want a selfie with Lucretia Mott, maybe it's too late over there. But, and she's, she's a funky looking person. Intimidating. Sure. But beautiful. Mild. Transcendentalism in its mildest form.